Yeah.
I'm going to sort of start extemporaneously, and then I'm going to have to go to my notes, because there's a lot of dates, a lot of, no. And, but if you miss anything, and the next issue of the Meredith News where this column will be?
It's going to go Thursday.
Yeah, on Thursday, if you've missed anything, read the Meredith News. And so, anyway, when I first came to Moultonborough in the 80s, I would hear people from time to time talk about Jim French, and that he was an extremely important person in town and in the state government. He'd been the chairman of the Appropriations Committee. He ran the town from his offices in that little building down there, which is the next one beyond the former Laconia Savings Bank, the Adele Taylor home, as we know it. He was also on the Railroad Commission, but there were so many strange anomalies. He really had a tight fist on the town of Moultonborough. He ran it pretty thoroughly by himself. But he never was a selectman. He was chairman of, he was on the Railroad Commission and chairman of the Railroad Committee in the State House, but the railroad never came to Moultonborough. And he was married to two women named Martha, both from Somersworth. He lived in a big house in the middle of this little town, and he never had any children. But halfway through, he expanded the house. So all these questions, most of which I have not found any answers to. But there you go. That's the way it is.
Were they both at the same time?
That would be interesting.
Yeah. In fact, I don't know, the connection, his wife, the first wife was from Somersworth. Assumedly, he'd go back to family gatherings. It might have been somebody else in the family. I don't know. Anyway, so I started to read, and there were various little references. There's so little written on him, and I'll give you the references that I could find. The history of Carroll County had a little bit. History of the Republican Party, New Hampshire men, 1,000 New Hampshire notables, probably all men. Brown books for several years in the House, the Boston Herald articles, which we have here, thanks to the scrapbooks of Marion Goodman, who left them to the museum. And to this day, 300 Years of New Hampshire Legislature by Leon Anderson. And there was no direct reference there to French, but much information on the Railroad Commissions, Committee, the railroad scandals. And Winston Churchill, not that one, the other one. Winston Churchill, the American one, who was more famous than Winston Churchill, the British one, when he was up and coming. He was a novelist. He moved to New Hampshire. He became very involved with the reform movement in New Hampshire, and he wrote a book called Coniston, which is a very interesting book, in a way. It's very dated. It's of that time. But if you're trying to see parallels, it's fascinating. And he was writing it obviously as an allegory or, of that nature, to explain how a small town politician who controls his own town by being the town moderator can rise to such prominence in the state, keep getting elected in his own hometown, and all of this. So there's a fascinating little book. But just the other thing that you have to note about James E. French is he was not a native. He came here when he was 6. From Tufton. But his mother was a native. His mother was the oldest daughter of Simon and Lydia Moulton, who lived there in the front room of this house. And in the end of her life, she came back and lived in this house with her husband, James French, who was a storekeeper from Tufton. So anyway, we know some of the influential things about the man. But we also know there were sort of unflattering things. In an article that appeared in the Boston Herald in April of 2007, which was right in the middle of the reform movement, he was depicted as a boss in Moultonborough and in the state. And in a poem that appears in that same page, a stanza from a long poem entitled "Darkest New Hampshire" reads, "Let darkest Moultonborough her wickedness retrench and purify her politics by Christianizing French."
Oh, wow.
Now, as far as I know, French was a Christian. He was a member of the Methodist Church there, and a deacon, and all this. He had his fingers in just about everything. These little scratches here. But anyway, it's as I said, it's hard to get a real handle on this because it seemed to be he was a pretty secretive guy. He liked to do things, off stage. He had his offices in the Eagle Hotel in Concord, which is almost back to back with the big railroad station which was there at the time, and probably some of you will remember that. I know I talked to Stuart and he remembers it. It was a huge, very ornate Victorian pile that ran down to the tracks. And that at that time, Concord was the second largest, I think, sort of rail depot after Boston. And with that whole area now that has the outlet stores and things like that down there. That was all the switching yards and the shops and so forth for initially the Concord Railway. Hello. And then eventually the Boston and Maine. And that, of course, is a story all by itself. But it's not necessarily a story from Moultonborough. Anyway, James Edward French was the oldest of 4 children of James French of Tuftonborough and Eveline Moulton of Moultonborough. She was the oldest of 4 children of Simon and Lydia Moulton, who with their family lived in Moultonborough Center, a corner in what we now call the Lamprey House. James and Eveline French and family lived first in Tuftonborough with James Sr., as I will call him, ran a store in Melvin Village. James Jr. was born in 1845 in Tuftonborough. In 1851, James Sr. bought a tavern stand and store, whatever tavern stand is, but I thought it'd be worth saying so, in Moultonborough Corner, what is now the Old Country Store, and he began business there. James Edward was 6. In 1861, James Sr. is appointed a postmaster. Now, it says in some of the things, he was appointed by Abraham Lincoln. I don't think Abraham Lincoln actually came and appointed him, but, he could have. And it was up to the president to name postmasters all over the country. And it was a big perk in those days because it was a big thing. We still went to the post office back then. And anyway, it was a political appointment. The Republican Party had just been born, and the Frenches became Republicans and remained so all their lives. James Edward was educated in local schools and at the New Hampshire Seminary in Tilton, but he did not attend college. We don't know whether he got a law degree or not. There are various different things. Some of the material, like Moultonborough of the 20th century, says he had his law offices in the Old Country Store. Other things, like these newspaper articles, say he never practiced law, but he was very familiar with it. Other things say he was a justice of the peace. And a justice of the peace back in those days did a lot of things that a lawyer would do today. And his brother George, however, did get a law degree, and he moved to Nashua. In 1864, James E. sort of left town, and he began clerking in Center Harbor, Plymouth, and Somersworth, where the Martyrs came from. We don't know what kind of clerking he was doing. When he was clerking in a store, one of the articles says he was clerking in a store. But he might have been law clerking. We don't know. He married his wife Martha in 1867, and in 1869, James Sr. decided to retire from business, and James E. returned home and took over operation of the store. And at the same time, he bought from his father what had been the Jacquard house. And by the way, this is a little autograph book that Norman recently found that belonged to Adele Jacquard, who was the daughter of Alexander Jacquard, who built that house. And that, by that house, I mean Adele Taylor's house. And it was, this, by the way, is the signature of James E. French from that autograph book. And this, by the way, is James. Handsome man. And this is the house that he bought from Alexander Jacquard. And you're not going to believe me, but this is actually the same house. The base of it, it was, apparently it was raised. You can see it in this picture that was in 1907. But this is sort of what it looks like today, as you know. So you can see the bottom of the house is the same. They apparently lifted up the roof and they put in a floor here, which was very common, and then dropped the roof back down again because the roof is probably original to around 1865. It certainly looks it. But Dick placed it kindly, let me come in there, which was a lot of fun. By the way, the house is in great shape. Anyway, where did I go? So, he bought the house from his father. His father then moved up and bought this one from Simon's successors. And so that meant that Eveline was moving back to her girlhood home. And 50 years later, Adele would move back to her girlhood home. But that's another story. It is at this point we begin to see his interest in politics, which developed first probably here, but soon reached into the state. In 1873, he assumed his father's position as postmaster, and in 1874 became a member of the Republican State Central Committee at the age of 29. He remained a member of that committee for most of the rest of his life. He was elected to the New Hampshire House of Representatives in 1878 and served there until 1881. The 1878 legislative session created a board of equalization to set increased railroad taxes. The legislation would be overturned by court rulings sponsored by the railroad corporations. The railroad corporations had been fighting amongst themselves and with the state since the 40s. There was a group of people in the state of New Hampshire in the 30s and 40s, 18 talking about now, who were called the Radical Democrats, and they didn't want railroads to come to New Hampshire because it would ruin this wonderful agrarian life that we had here in New Hampshire. And then about 20 years later, when they realized the wonderful agrarian life was ruining itself all by itself, they decided they did need railroads. So there was sort of a flip, not completely, but soon after that, the state supported the growth of railroads, but they also wanted to control it. They didn't want it, they didn't want monopolies, obviously. They didn't want people to be overcharged for the use of these things. So there was a lot of back and forth and a lot of out-and-out corruption. And in 1879, a year into his first term, James E. was appointed by the legislature to the Board of Railroad Commissioners, which was a quasi-governmental board instituted to try to exercise some kind of control on the railroads. The railroad had first come to New Hampshire in 1838 and had quickly become a force and often a corrupting force. The Railroad Commission always had a difficult time maintaining independence from the influence of the corporations. James E. French served on the Board of Railroad Commissions until 1883, in which year the legislature, quote, returned railroad corporation appointments to the governor and the council with handsome salaries and gave them stronger controls over rates, profits, and operating procedures. I think this was supposed to have been some sort of reform. They were trying to get rid of some of these corrupt commissioners, and so it continued on, but in sort of a different form. The 1883 session also enacted a law permitting restricted railroad leases and formation of new corporations without legislative approval. But this law was overturned by the courts in early 1887, leading the way to the longest legislative session ever recorded up to 1837. That's when they were meeting every 2 years and, just for a few months. And one of the most contentious and corrupt. James E. French was back in the legislature then, his only term in the Senate, where a lot of this was happening. And that was in 1887. By the way, just as a little sidebar, if you've ever wondered why our state legislators get paid less than our selectmen, it's because of that session. They were paid $200 back then, which is probably a lot of money back then, but they were also paid for any day they worked over the supposed session. This thing went on for 5 months, and they were racking up this overtime at huge rates. And so the next legislature said, okay, we're going to cap it at 200. And they never changed it. So, there we are. And nobody seemed to mind, right? We're all happy with this, right? Betsy Patton was happy. In 1882, he assumed what must have been a federal political appointment during the administration of President Chester A. Arthur as Deputy Collector of Internal Revenue, and held that position until 1886, when President Grover Cleveland, a Democrat, briefly changed the political landscape. In 1884, at age 40, James E. retired from the active management of the store, although he continued to own the store, turning it over to Hamlin Huntress, who, after the Frenches died, lived in this house. Anyway, any connections here, saying anything? In November 1886, James French Sr. died. In 1887, James E. French served his only term in the New Hampshire Senate from the Plymouth District. This was that record-breaking 1887 New Hampshire legislative session. At its core was a legislature that the Boston and Maine Railroad substantially bought, manipulating elections in the towns, bringing in inexperienced legislators favorable to their cause, and attempting to control the session's deliberation and influence its votes to produce a railroad consolidation bill. At that time, there were primarily 2 big railroads in New Hampshire. Boston and Maine, which had been buying up little ones all over the state, and the Concord, which had been buying up other ones all over the state. And they wanted to stay separate. Boston, Maine wanted to control the whole shebang. So there was a bill introduced called the Hazen Bill, which would allow the Boston and Maine to have a near monopoly on rail business in the state and be able to set rates and control service as they wished. Competing and opposing legislation would have favored the Concord Railroad and its branch lines, which were the ones that came up through here, in which the government had a part interest. This was all part of a constant battle between the corporations and the legislators who were beholden to them, and the reformers and their political opponents. The Senate, heavily dominated by Republicans, voted for the Hazen Bill. James E. French was a Republican, and he was closely identified with the Boston and Maine, so it is almost certain that he voted for the bill. The Hazen Bill was in fact vetoed by Governor Sawyer of New York, of New London, 3 times, in fact, and it didn't become law. But in the next term, a new bill was passed. By that time, the Boston and Maine and the Concord had just sort of gotten together and worked things out. Little money changed. And giving the Boston, Maine what it wanted, but reserving the state the right to maintain some control over affairs and service. In 1889, the Republican Benjamin Harrison office, James E. French was named Collector of Revenues for New Hampshire, Maine, and Vermont. The History of the Republican Party by Leslie, 1899, Volume 2, page 272, says of him, his intuitive perception is remarkably keen, and indeed this may be called his chief characteristic. Rapid in thought, quick to seize upon an emergency, Mr. French has lifted himself to a successively high position. In each of them he has acquitted himself with credit. In 1893, with Cleveland back in office, there is a pause in his growing resume. He was actively local as town moderator, member of the school board, and I think then later chairman, town treasurer, justice of the peace, and he was still on the Republican State Central Committee. In 1897, he returned to the Hampshire House of Representatives and was assigned to the Committee on Railroads, soon becoming its chairman. The railroad corporations, principally now the Boston, Maine, were still defying state control, and their corrupting influence inspired a reform movement led principally by Robert P. Bass of Peterborough, grandfather of Representative Charles Bass, and popular author Winston Churchill of Cornish. Churchill wrote a romantic novel, Coniston, published in 1906, which has as its subplot, but principal intention, an expose of how local bosses gained control of state politics through the control of the towns, and how they became entwined with the railroads. It is fascinating reading and gives what is probably a real sense of the times. In the summer of 1906, with the reform movement gaining ground, Teddy Roosevelt was in office and going after the monopolies nationally. James E. French became a target of the reformers, and in early 1907 he left the Committee on Railroad and took up a position of chairman of the Appropriations Committee, where he remained for the rest of his legislative career. He has sometimes been called the watchdog of the Treasury. Now, here I will. This one is actually, this is a copy of an article that's in the library. It's, of course, very faded, a little difficult to read, but you still can read it. This is another one of the articles that came out at that time. And this article talks about actually a movement, and it mentions two people from Moultonborough, Reverend D.E. Burns and Dr. F.S. Lovering, who were trying to remove French from the school board, the moderator's office, and so forth. One of the things he had real tight control of the schools too, and a lot of people like Lovering and Burns and so forth wanted trained teachers for their kids. So they were trying to get that done, but French knew that it would be more expensive to have trained teachers than just to have local girls who, who probably would also vote for him. So he resisted that, and they weren't able to get rid of him in this movement. And this is the article where that one of the poem comes from. And so what else we got here? I'll let you look at him again. This is a different one. This is also from that time, 1907. So in May of 1907, which is probably a sad coincidence, Martha Hill French, the first Martha, died and was buried in the French plot in the Lee Cemetery, which is interesting because other people in this family were buried in the Mason Cemetery, which is up off Sheridan Road. But the Lee Cemetery is where the family sort of started from a long time ago. I don't know why they were buried there. In 1914, James French, at age 69, married Martha Hanson from Somersworth. James E. French died in 1919, survived by his second wife, Martha, who died in 1934. In his will, James E. French left money to build the combination town library and offices, the old part of our library now, both of which, at least in part, had for many years been in a portion of his store, along with the post office, of which he was the postmaster, and his law office. So this is it didn't happen until Martha died and left the land, but this is a plaque that's in the library now that honors James E. French, one of the few things in town that mentions his name. But he obviously had a fascinating life and was a powerful and influential person in the town, in the state. So it is frustrating and tantalizing. There are no good biographical studies of him. What I've been able to find are a few dry resumes, mostly supplied by him probably, a few anecdotes two now substantial newspaper articles and a poem. The anecdote and the newspaper article, I'm still up here. The anecdote and the newspaper article and a poem are in a folder in the library, and also here in these wonderful scrapbooks that Marion Goodwin kept all of her life. And the anecdote, as it says, and I know many of you have heard this before, but bear with me, it's so much fun. It was only natural that the people of Moultonborough were proud of their fellow citizen, Uncle Jim French, and each year they honored him by electing him the moderator of the town meeting. Ballots were small slips of paper with the candidate's name thereon. One year, Uncle Jim was counting ballots for moderator and found one from some person other than himself. Holding up the ballot before the assembled group, he asked, "Who cast this ballot?" Of course, there was no response. So Uncle Jim rolled up the ballot between his thumb and forefinger in a little ball, which he threw to one side with the comment, "It must have been a mistake."
One way to do it.
But in fact, not everybody in Moultonborough supported Uncle Jim. According to the newspaper article in 1907, several Moultonborough residents, including Lovering and Burns, were mounting a movement to wrench at least some of the local power from French's hands. The highly unflattering article, published after the reform movement had made life uncomfortable for the bosses, and 1 month before the Martha Hill's death, also dwelt on King French's position in the state. It reads in part, "He was one of the principals attacked in the reform campaign last summer, and on his devoted head were poured many anathemas and pronunciaments of the Freeman Awake style from earnest stump speakers during this exciting political occasion. All the charges against his growth and strength and corporate interests failed to cause Jim French to turn a hair. But he nevertheless suggested to the bosses at the opening of the session this year that it would be a good idea not to make him chairman of the Committee on the Railroads again. Where then shall we put you?" he was asked. "Oh, I guess chairman of the Committee on Appropriations will suit," I usually reply. Well, you shouldn't believe everything you read in the papers, and on the other hand, the account is somewhat consistent with the oral history, the bits about running the state from his house. If so, how did he do it? In fact, the newspaper article was rather indignant about how such an insignificant town as Moultonborough could produce a person who had such great power in the state. So how is it done then? How do you control the town to such an extent that it will continually support you in your causes locally and in state politics? Because this movement to unseat him did not work. He continued to serve in the legislature until 1915 when he was 70, 4 years before his death, and he remained chairman of the Appropriations Committee to the end. The newspaper article and the novel Coniston suggest it was done by time-honored political means through money and favors. Many townspeople would come to him. And you have to remember, this is 1915, when things are not going so well in this part of the state. People have land, but they can't really make much money from it. But that's all they have. So people would come to him and other prominent and prosperous town fathers like William H. Mason or Samuel Emerson. Anyway, to borrow money, perhaps to buy seed for this year's planting or to make repairs to the house. Jim French would hold their mortgages, and when it came time to vote, these men, indebted to him, literally knew for whom it would be best to vote. And others were indebted to him figuratively, since he acted locally as justice of the peace, hired the school teachers and a judge, and it was in a position to decide cases in such a way that he earned favor. There was another little episode that I read about in Moultonborough to the 20th century, Sturtevant Matthews' book, and she talks about the fact there had been a road, the road over that connects Bean Road to Red Hill Road. It's now Sibley Road. But that wasn't originally a road. I mean, it was a road into Kelly's house, and it was a road into Sturdivant's house, and then there was a brook, and there was no way to get across. But they, to accommodate all the people going up to Red Hill to walk up and look at the beautiful view, they allowed a road to be established. But then apparently there were a lot of trespassing and annoyance. So they decided, each of them decided to close it off. One with a fence and one with some boulders or something. And Jim French was, as we know, a power in town. And so he went to Kelly and Sturdivant and said, that's a town road, you can't block it off. And they said, no, it's not a town road, it's on our land, and we can block it off. And he said, well, then I want to buy it. And they said, okay, and he offered them a price that they thought was ridiculous. And so they said no. And but then Finn Kelly, said, but I will give it to you for free if you pay for the fencing along my road so people don't come clambering across my fields and stuff. And French said, no, that was too expensive. He would take it to court. He took it to court, and he lost. So eventually, the court decided in favor of the landowners, and they were, recompensed, and they were paid an appropriate amount for their land, and now we have a road. So he was a very tight-fisted guy, and he had a reputation for that in the store, and home, and probably in the state. Anyway. He died in 1919 and is buried next to his parents and wives. Which makes me, I think I must be wrong about the Lee because his parents are buried in the Mason Cemetery. Anyway. He is mostly, he's nicely described in the obituaries, in the don't speak ill of the dead style. And it was quite an event. It was held at the Methodist Church, and it was well attended by dignitaries from across the state, the sitting governor, the most recent governor, various representatives, and also by Thomas G. Plant, who knew a little something about money and lawsuits and things like that. So anyway, that was James E. French, and I still don't have the answers to my questions about why the railroad never came here, or because back in those days, having a railroad in town really was very important. And maybe he just felt maybe he actually blocked it. I've heard people say he may have blocked it because he didn't want the noise and the dust and so forth. But I just want to close, if I can do it. Maybe I need to get my glasses. Read a little bit of this poem. And I've actually gone through it a little bit and tried to find out who the names are of some of these people. And Kimball is referenced, and Kimball was what?
In Gilgotham?
Yes, Kimball's Castle. Right, Benjamin Kimball, and he was the chairman of the Boston and Maine Railroad, and then there's other people. Henry Putney, who was also very much involved in the railroads, and he was the editor of the Manchester Mirror, that was always very supportive. And then John Sanborn, who was a Democratic representative from Wakefield. Anyway. Take up the white man's burden in famed New Hampshire's bounds, and solve the knotty question our governing propounds. Why are the church bells silent, your granite hills among, and Christianity unknown in hymns of praise unsung? Call home your missionaries from the Sandwich Islands, and pass your contribution but for charity at home. neath shadow of our mountains and midst our city's din, inept, inspect the great damp mines, anyway. Corrupting stalks unfettered throughout the granite state, unchecked by law it flourishes, foreshadowing our fate. I'm trying to get to the part where it talks about French. Here we go. Stand forth as missionaries among the railroad gang, these eminent professionals, John Sanborn and Paul Lang. Let darkest Moultonborough her wickedness retrench, and purify her politics by Christianizing French. And Manchester's great mirror then to nature hold up Putney through the clothing of the wolf still smells a trifle muttony. Then send out Mr. Kimball as Joshua's bright compeer to clog the wheels of time in heaven's starry field. So anyway, that is the kind of stuff that was running around about our dear James French. If anybody has any stories about French that cast any light on this, please let me or Dan Hager know. Diane.
Well, I don't have a story about French other than having heard my mom and dad refer to the French family and
Yeah.
French's store. And of course, when I was growing up, the post office was still in the old country store.
Was it?
Yes, it was.
Oh.
And but what really surprised me that I did not know that when you spoke of Dr. Frank S. Lamprey, that was my mom's stepdad.
Oh, really?
And I was
Well, he was on the good side.
Yeah, I know. I was very happy to hear. And the other thing that struck me is that things don't change a lot.
It's still dark as Moultonborough. Yeah.
I do have one comment about Dr. Lovren. I remember Diane's mother saying that Dr. Frank S. Lovering was the only Democrat in Moultonborough.
Oh, that's right. That's very true.
Must have been very long.
Well, he's obviously going after the chief Republican in the state, practically.
Yeah.
But yeah, I remember Dot saying that, and I thought that was.
Well, I remember when we first came here in the 80s, somewhere, mid-80s, and I went to vote for the first time. And of course, they didn't know who I was. You know, I lived out on an island someplace. And I came in and they handed me the pink ballot, and I looked at it. This is a primary, you know. I looked at it and I said, I'll have the other one.
They stopped leaving?
They started looking around for it. Anything else?
That's funny. It's very funny.
So anyway, help yourself to looking at these things, and I think a minimum of hands could be allowed to look in this scrapbook, because you can read it a lot better in this. This is actually, you know, in very good condition considering.
Judy, when you mentioned the things that you researched, did you look into any of the stuff from the legislature, any of their records? He wiped out everything then.
You know, I don't know. I think it was all just done so privately, so quietly, that there were no records.
Is that, oh, no, yeah.
You know, not in that sense. I mean, this,
It's funny that somebody that was such a control freak didn't have an ego enough to want anybody to know anything.
I don't think he cared about that. I don't think it was an ego thing. It was power,
Yeah.
but I don't think it was ego. He liked controlling things, clearly. But this portrait is from the State House. It's in their archives, I believe. And but it's in the basement. You know, I don't know when it was displayed, if ever. But yeah, Dan.
So regarding the legislature, I think in those days, the legislature just published the bare minimum of information about its members, you know, what term did they serve, what committee might they have been on,
Absolutely.
but nothing about, you know, their positions on things or their votes on
Yeah.
things or whatever.
Yeah.
It's very, very sparse.
Yeah, yeah. That's sort of what I found.
Yeah.
And all of these other sources that I mentioned, they are all, you know, the 1,000 notables in New Hampshire and so forth. They're little squibs, like somebody would write you and say, could you send us a little resume or, you know, a little sketch? And you supply it. So naturally you come out pretty well, unless you're very self-effacing.
Yeah.
Mine are always come out very poorly, but that's just because I'm so modest. Anyway, that's it. And I'd like to say there's a PhD dissertation in there somewhere, but I don't think there is. I don't think there's much more, but Dan, if it'll be found, Dan will find it. So buy your paper on Thursday.
It must have been frustrating to try to research something that there wasn't much to research.
Absolutely. But the fun part of it was I was doing it in the winter, you know, in the woods. And I came up to the library and got everything Jane had, you know, and that didn't take me more than an afternoon. So I had seen that reference to Coniston, so I got the novel, and that was fascinating. I mean, in reading, because then he was able to flesh it out, and in French's will, actually, I think, yeah, in French's will, he forgave some of the debts of some of the people, particularly wives and children, you know, widows and children and so forth. But if you go down to the Registry of Deeds in Ossipee and look up, you know, Jane French for a particular, you know, year, pages and pages of property that he owned or controlled with mortgages, almost all mortgages. Probably, yeah, didn't own until it was foreclosed upon. And, you know, somebody said one of the things, if you wanted money in this town, you had to go to Plymouth or Laconia to the bank. You know, this is a long trip and times are tough, and it's much easier to go to the store and knock on the door and ask Jim French if he could just loan you a little. Of course, happy to, just sign here. And then next year you can't pay it back, so you get a little bit pretty soon, you know, there you have it.
Pretty good.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.